Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here, again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of Bach's chorale harmonizations. Today we're looking at in dulci jubilo, which translates to in sweet rejoicing. Pretty interesting to have a Latin title today. It's a very interesting chorale, definitely some modal influence in this one, if not just in like the usages of E flat throughout, but really not actually throughout, just at the beginning and at the end here. But some of the chord progressions aren't traditionally functional, and I think that that's very interesting. There's definitely some points of contention throughout this chorale, and it is a longer chorale today, so we're just going to hop right into the analysis. So one flat in the key signature, we start on F major and we end on F major, so I think the overall tonality of this chorale is F major. We then go to D minor, D, A, D, and F. That's our sixth chord, passing seventh in the bass, B flat, D, and F. That's a four chord, B flat major. Again, like a thirds bass progression here to start things off is kind of interesting. A little bit of a, I would say, modal influence, just because we're not typically used to seeing chords that are a third apart without some type of passing chord. Granted, there is a passing seventh there, so I don't know. It does feel like an unusual opening, though. 1 to 6 is a very common opening, but taking 4 after that is on the less common side. Then we get A, C, E, and A, again continuing that unusual pattern to A minor, which is our 3 chord. Neighbor tone here, like an accented neighbor tone actually here in the bass before we get A again, which is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. And then we get G, B flat, E, and B flat, which is E diminished over G, which is 7-6, 3 going to 7. That's what I've been calling transitive harmony, where the chord goes against the cycle of falling fifths and uses the same voice leading to approach the dominant going up a fifth. A is a non-chord tone, so we will mark it, and that takes us to what appears to be 1, but with this E flat being more prevalent in the overall chord, I think this is functioning more so as 5 of 4, and we've seen this before in cadences. It is relatively uncommon, but resolving to 5 of 4 and having 5 of 4 appear as a predominant in a plagal cadence is a device that we've seen Bach use before. But this E flat, despite being a non-chord tone, tells us that it's going to resolve to some type of B flat major chord, which it does. Both E flat and D are passing tones. We then get C, B flat, F, and D. C is an accented non-chord tone, B flat is our root of our 4 chord, and then we cadence on F major, F, A, F, and C. Tonic triad, root position. Moving on to the next phrase, a bit of ambiguity here. I think you could analyze it as a perfect authentic cadence or as a half cadence. It really is a toss-up depending on how you hear it. I hear it as a perfect authentic cadence, but if you hear it as a half cadence, that's valid as well. So we're looking for a point in which we modulate to the key of C major, and I think it's going to happen right before the cadence. So this is effectively operating in the grand scheme of the form as a big half cadence, but I do think a little modulation occurs based on the chords that happen in and around the cadence. So starting things off with D minor, D, A, F, and F. It's our 6th chord. Then we have passing tones in the bass and the alto before we get B flat, D, and F. Starting this phrase off just like the previous phrase. We then have F, A, C, and A. That's our tonic and root position. Passing tones in the bass again, before, or in the lower voices rather, before we get D, F, D, and B flat. It's B flat major over D, which is 4-6. And then we get E, G, C, and C, which is C major in first inversion, 5-6. And then on the end of the beat, we get C, C, E, and C, which is like taking our chord and putting it in root position, kind of, sorta. I am going to say that the chord, this is where the modulation occurs to C major. You could say that it happens on the 6th of the chord as well. It is kind of interesting for it to happen on the end of the beat, but I feel like, with 2 C major chords happening consecutively, generally speaking, when we have consecutive chords that are part of the common chord modulation, like a zone, it happens at the end of the zone. That's just how I've been trying to be consistent with it across my analyses, but really at any point, like at this C major or this C major, it can modulate, at least the way that I hear it. And that takes us to G major, G, B natural, G, and D. It's our 5 chord. And then we cadence on C major, C, G, E, and C, which is just going to be taking us back to the key of F major and turning into our 5 chord. And then we get another phrase here. Well, we get another phrase, yes, because there's multiple phrases in the chorale, but we actually end the next phrase not with a cadence in F major like we might expect, but we get a phrase in the key of D minor here. So we're looking for a point at which we modulate, and I think it's pretty clear where we modulate. Actually, it happens in and around the middle of the phrase, and we'll get to it when we get to it. So 5 takes us to 1, F major, F, A, F, and C. It's our tonic triad. Then we get B flat, F, and D. That is our 4 chord, B flat major. That takes us to B flat, C, E, and C. That's C7 over B flat, which is 5-4-2. Third inversion 7 chord. We would expect this to resolve to 1-6. A, F, F, and C. Tonic triad and first inversion, so it resolves the way we would expect. Apologies, that does not resolve the way we would expect. I just was on autopilot there. We resolve to A, D, F, and C. So we get an irregular resolution here. This is resolving where we would expect in the bass, but the root of the chord is D. So we would expect this to be a first inversion F major chord, but we get a second inversion D minor 7 chord, which, to be fair, is basically an F major chord with a D rather than a doubled other tone. So really, as far as irregular resolutions are concerned, this is about as tame of an irregular resolution as one might get. Just the Roman numerals might throw you off if you are not privy to the chord that's actually happening here. But yeah, it is technically an irregular resolution because the chord doesn't fully resolve the way we would expect it to. But it's a pretty neat variation. Then we go to G, E, G, and B flat, which is E diminished over G, which is our 7 chord. And instead of going to 1, this chord actually turns into a predominant in the key of D minor. So 7-6 turns into 2-6. That's a pretty nifty thing that Bach does from time to time. Not the most common chord Bach uses to modulate between keys, but we do see it from time to time. We then get another 5-4-2 chord, this time in the key of D minor, G, A, C sharp, and A, which is A7 over G. And this resolves where we would, actually this does not resolve where we would expect. Again, I was on autopilot. F, B flat, D, and A. Again, this resolves to another 6-4-3 chord. So we see this pair of irregular resolutions, but it makes sense that the chord is sort of like a mirror or a symmetrical version of the previous phrase or fragment. And then 6-4-3 takes us to E, C sharp, E, and A, which could be one of two things. It could be 5-6. It's like a toss-up, really. I'm going to call it 7, or yeah, I'm going to call it E, C sharp, E, and G. I'm going to call it 7-6. It could be 5-6-4, but I'm going to call it 7-6 because I do see symmetry between the two phrases. And if this were 5-6-4, it's basically the same thing as 7-6, but 5-4-2, 6-4-3, 7-6 to 5-4-2, 6-4-3, 7-6 just makes more sense to me before we resolve to D minor, D, A, D, and F. Okay, moving ahead, we get an imperfect authentic cadence in the key, sorry, I wrote perfect authentic cadence, imperfect authentic cadence in the key of F, and you could look at this as a direct modulation, you could look at this as a common chord modulation. I think with these moving from relative minor to relative major, it's a bit of a toss-up, usually not as clear as the other way around, but I'm just going to say that this F major is 3 in the key of D minor, and it is also 1 in the key of F major. You could say that this D minor is 6 in the key of F major. It's a bit of a zone because the chords are diatonic to both pitch collections. You could also say that we don't modulate until later into the phrase as well, but I hear the beginning of the phrase in F major, so that will definitely shape the way that I craft my analysis. So we start off in the key of F with our tonic, we then get B flat, D, F, and G, which is G minor 7 over B flat, 2, 6, 5, and then we get G, B flat, E, and G. Although I think there's room here for this to be a 7-6 chord, it's not very common for Bach to go from 2 to 7. It's the combination of predominant and dominant functioning chords that's sort of like the weakest because they're basically the same chord in terms of pitch content. So we usually see Bach play around with them and sort of use the two chords not interchangeably but in conjunction with one another, not in the chord progression necessarily, but usually like using a passing tone to separate them, which I think is exactly what's happening here. I think this E is an accented passing tone, and really this is just taking the chord and putting it in root position and removing the 7th. And the main reason why I think this is the case has to do with the next chord being a 5 chord, and it's much more common to see like a 2 go to a 5 than it is for 7 to go to 5. But I think they're both valid analyses based on how you view the harmony and what your relationship with the harmony is. But the next beat is C, C, E, and G. C major. Then we get F major, F, C, F, and A, tonic triad, passing tone in the bass. A here briefly takes the chord and puts it in first inversion, so we don't need to reiterate the Roman numeral. Passing tone in the bass again before we get C, C, E, and G. That's our 5 chord, C major, passing 7th in the bass, and then we get A, C, F, and F, tonic triad in first inversion. We briefly see the chord. Do we briefly see the chord in root position on the next beat? We kind of do, but we don't ever, it's not fully realized, so I'm just not going to mark these. And this G is sort of like a late neighbor tone. And then we get C, C, F, and G. F being an accented non-chord tone, kind of like a 4-3 suspension, which is common over dominant chords, which this definitely is, C major. And then we resolve to F major, F, C, F, and A, tonic triad in root position. Next phrase takes us back to the key of D minor with an imperfect authentic cadence, but we spend the majority of our time in F major for sure. We start with F major, F, A, F, and C. No need to reanalyze there. Passing 7th on the bass, and then we get D, B flat, F, and D, which is B flat major in first inversion 4-6. Then we get E, G, G, and C, which is C major in first inversion 5-6. Passing tones in the bass and the alto before we get C, E, G, and B flat, which is just taking our chord, putting it in root position and adding the 7th, and that takes us to some semblance of an F major chord. We have F, E, G, and A, right? We have like a bit of a double suspension going on here where we have a 7-6 suspension going over the bass, and then we have a 9-8 suspension going over the bass as well. So I do think a tonic triad is being implied here. I'm going to put it in parentheses because the double suspension does create a bit of a crunchy harmony here. This G is a neighbor tone, and typical Bach for the bass to change and the quality of the chord to also change with it. We get D, we get F, we get A, and we get B flat, which is, so, wait, what am I saying? We have A, D, F, and A, which is D minor in second inversion, which I think is the beginning of our 1-6-4 chord, which then takes us to what we would typically expect, which is 5, A major, A, C sharp, E, and A with a passing seventh in the melody. So we have this kind of staggered bracket here. Yeah, I think that's kind of interesting that Bach is modulating over the 1-6-4 chord. I can't say I've seen that, actually. It's either been a really long time since I've seen this, or we haven't seen this, which is pretty exciting, modulating over the secondary, or not secondary, modulating over the second inversion 1 chord in a cadential context, which is pretty neat. And we have a double suspension going on as well. Got to make sure I write that down in my notes, because I did not analyze that in my first pass through. And then we cadence on D minor, of course, D, A, D, and F. Tonic triad. Okay, moving ahead to the next phrase, we get a Phrygian half cadence in the key of D minor. But I think we revisit the key of F major similar to how we started the second system. So we go to F major, this time in, actually, these should both be in first inversion now that I see it. Creating some symmetry in my analysis here. I do think F is the point which we modulate. It could be a common chord, it could be a direct modulation. I think they're both valid. It really just depends on how you look at it. Honestly, it's a toss-up. For me, I tend to analyze more using common chords than direct modulations, but sometimes direct modulations just happen, and I just feel like they're in the minority here. So 1-6 takes us to B flat, D, F, and G. We're seeing a very similar beginning to the phrase here, and again we have G, B flat, E, and G. Again, this could be 7-6. I do believe, however, this E is an accented passing tone, and this is actually just taking the chord and putting it in root position. So it's this D that's the fifth of the chord rather than this E being the root of the chord, because 2 is going to take us to 5. C, C, E, and G. And that takes us to F like we would expect. F, C, F, and A. Passing tone in the bass. Again, there could probably be, for the most part, there's probably like a repeat in this section, even though there are slight variations between the two phrases. But we have another passing tone in the bass, C, C, E, and G, which is our 5 chord. A is a non-chord tone here, so that's a difference because we have a passing tone here rather than this being the case where we have a skip down in the bass that takes us up to B flat, or sorry, to D, D, A, E, and F, which I think is our 6 chord. And the main difference between these two phrases definitely is where the modulation occurs, right? Because here we have a phrase that ends in the key of F major. Here we're moving to the key of D minor. So I do think this is where we modulate to D minor, and it is now our 1 chord. And then we get this interesting harmony here. We have C, we have A, and we have F, which is potentially setting us up for a 1-6-4-5-1 progression in the key of F, but that's not what we get. And this D minor really does make me feel like we've modulated. It's a 3-6-4 chord, which is highly unusual, but in the grand scheme of things, it does make sense for a 3 chord to go to a 4 chord. We do see 3 go to 4 with quite a bit of frequency in Bach's chorales. So B flat, D, and G. So 4-6, which is typically the chord that we see in a Phrygian half cadence. Sometimes we see other chords baked in there, but the 4-6 chord's like always there in terms of how you could interpret the chord. And that takes us to 5. A major, A, E, C sharp, and A. This 3-6-4 chord is quite interesting as a that's not even really a predominant chord, because the 4-6 chord is the predominant, right? Because we're cadencing on the 5, but this 3-6-4 chord is quite fascinating, especially seeing an F major chord after the modulation. Of course, you could say the modulation happens over the G minor chord, but I feel like it happens a bit earlier. The D landing on D minor here feels like we're in the key of D by this point after this deceptive progression, 5 going to 6. Regardless, we're going to find our way moving back to the key of F for the rest of the chorale. A couple beats into the next phrase, we get a half cadence here in the key of F major, and we start off with an interesting rest. I had to check a couple of versions here to see if this rest wasn't a formatting error. The rest is actually there. So we start off with B flat, F, D, and D, which is B flat major, It's a 6 chord, and I think any of these points could be a point in which we mark the modulation, but afterwards we get A, G, D, and D. This is a very interesting harmony that's happening here. I think the G is an accented non-chord tone. What we actually get is A, D, and D. I mean, maybe there's a 1-6-4 chord going on here. We're going to have two sequential measures here that have an unusual chord happening on this beat, and I think really what's happening is that we're just getting a passing chord, and I'm just going to say that maybe there is a passing chord going on here, but I don't really think the chords are fully analyzable, at least in the same light as the other chords that we've seen up until this point. So I think we go from 6 to G, B flat, D, and D, which is 4 in the key of D minor. Again, this idea of 6 going to 4 like we saw at the beginning of the chorale. I do think this G minor, however, is where we go back to the key of F, where it is now our 2 chord, namely because of what we see on the next beat, which is C major, C, G, D, and E, 9/8 suspension over our 5 chord. Kind of uncommon to see 9/8 suspensions over dominant chords. It's more of like a root position tonic chord thing, but here we are seeing it. But yeah, 5 chord, and that takes us to what's happening on the next beat, which similar to what happened in the previous measure. We have a passing 7th in the bass, we have A, we have C, we have B flat, which is also a non-chord tone in this context, and we also have this passing D here. So I think maybe we have 5-4-2 going on here. It's not 100% there though, so take this with a grain of salt. I don't think this is like, you know, perfectly justifiable analysis, but it's difficult to know exactly what's going on. But afterwards we do resolve somewhat logically. We get A, C, E, and E. So not F. We would expect F in first inversion, but we actually get 3 here. So another irregular 5-4-2 resolution. This one's definitely not as codifiable as the 4-2 chords that we saw earlier, but I think it's a coincidence that there's this idea of a 4-2 chord not resolving usually, like multiple times in this chorale. It's pretty fascinating. We also have a passing tone here in the tenor. It's like a bit of a deceptive progression, but instead of seeing 6, we're seeing 3, so the other side of the tonic functioning chords, right? So after our 3 chord, Bach starts to, fall into the cycle of falling fifths here before our half cadence. A very interesting half cadence too, where we spend a whole measure developing 6. We have D, A, E, and F, again with this 9/8 suspension over 6, typically something we see over tonic triads, interestingly enough, and the fact that we're seeing it over D minor after having moved to the key of F major is pretty interesting. But I think the big picture that's going on here is we have 2 going to 5, and then we have 3 going to 6. So there's this pair of fifths. So instead of going to, it's sort of like a sequential progression here. You wouldn't see it from the you wouldn't see it just by looking on the page. Maybe the melody would allude to it a little bit, but other than that, really it just looks like a, maybe the bass too. We have B flat going down to G, and then we have C going down to A. There's a bit of a sequence going on here. But then we go to 6, neighboring 7th in the bass, neighbor tone in the melody, and then we have D, A, D, and F. Typically we see a D minor chord in first inversion here, but because of the neighbor tone, we're seeing D minor in root position. We don't need to reanalyze this. We have a passing tone, a little delayed neighbor tone here, delayed passing tone here, and a passing tone in the melody as well. That gives us E, G, D, and B flat, so it's sort of like a no, that's a G chord actually. I'm not really going to analyze that. That's sort of like, it gives an idea of 7. I don't think it's the end of the world though, or something that's worth analyzing. It's not entirely intact. I think the B flat would need to be there in order for me to justifiably analyze it, but there is a bit of a passing 7 chord in root position there, which is pretty interesting. And then we have F, A, D, and A, which is just taking our 6 chord and putting it in first inversion. And then we get B flat, which is a non-chord tone, B flat, F, and D, which is a bit of a 4 chord. I will mark that because it is entirely intact. and that takes us to E, G, C, and C, which is a first inversion 5 chord. I just want to double check and see if that's actually correct. It is in fact a first inversion 5 chord, so this is like an inverted half cadence, which is interesting. We seldom see inverted cadences in general, especially half cadences. It is actually very uncommon to see an inverted cadence, but it's amongst the inverted cadences, it's much more common for us to see inverted authentic cadences, if I'm not mistaken. So seeing an inverted half cadence is particularly unusual. But our last phrase, really the only thing that's interesting about this last phrase is the cadence. You could analyze this as a plagal cadence, but I also think there's room here to analyze this as some type of authentic cadence, perhaps a perfect authentic cadence. I think it's a plagal cadence, though, just the melody throws us for a loop, depending on where you feel like the cadence is happening and whether or not this end here is like a tag or like a codetta, something like that. But starting the phrase off with F major, we have F, A, C, and A, tonic triad. We have G, B flat, F is a chord tone, E is a chord tone. With this A, not really an analyzable chord. You might be able to throw something in there as like a 7/6 chord, maybe a little bit with the E, the G, and the B flat, but with the A there, it's difficult to justify as a fully analyzable chord. But afterwards, it does take us to 1/6. So let me put the Roman numeral there because that looks like I'm just reiterating 7/6. So maybe the 7/6 is there. That would definitely be a normative chord progression, but with the A being held over in the melody, it's difficult to fully justify this being a 7 chord, but definitely the lower voices are spelling a 7 chord, that's for sure. So after 1/6, we get B flat, D, F, and G. It's 2/6/5, G minor 7 over B flat. And then we see G, B flat, F, and G. They're both chord tones, so we don't need to mark them. And then we see C major, C, C, E, and G. No need to reanalyze, what am I talking about? We don't need to reanalyze here, but this is a 5 chord C major. Sorry, this is a longer chorale. And then we come full circle, just like the beginning of the chorale here, where we see this E flat in the bass that adds a little bit of modal flair, but instead of 5 resolving to 1, and this is the main reason why I think this is a perfect authentic cadence, it resolves to 5/6 of 4, because this E flat really has a tendency to want to pull down to D, and it really makes D like E flat's like the tendency tone that takes us to D, and D is going to be the third of our B flat chord, which is, so instead of this being our tonic, it is a higher function. It's a secondary dominant of 4. So we have B flat, D, and F. There's our 4 chord, like we would expect. Neighbor tones in the inner voices, and then we get the same tones as before, so we don't need to mark them. B flat's a chord tone, G is a chord tone, is a non-chord tone, so I'm going to mark it, and then we cadence on F. So I think we end on a plagal cadence, which I think is interesting, definitely more of like a modal and earlier music feel, and it's pretty cool that Bach comes full circle with this sort of looping form. But that's today's analysis. I think all in all, the big takeaways are the tonics being used as 5 of 4. In major keys, it's more apparent because they're both, unlike on a minor key where the tonic has to get changed from minor to major, in major keys the tonics are already major, so it's the use of that flatted 7th that makes it apparent, and that takes us sort of into the realm of Mixolydian. So yeah, it's interesting when that happens. Next is the 4/2 resolutions. We actually get 3 of them, kind of, sort of, 2.5 maybe. But yeah, the fact that 2 of them happen consecutively is pretty interesting. And also we have that double suspension, wherever that was, right here. The double suspension is pretty interesting as well, because it turns like what would be, or what we would assume to be a tonic triad, into 1/6/4 in the key of D minor. Very beautiful gesture. That's happening under the hood there. And the ambiguity of some of the cadences is up for discussion as well. You know, is this a perfect authentic cadence, or is this a half cadence? This comes up fairly frequently in my analysis. I just don't know. I think both are valid analyses, and the fact that I can see both perspectives, I think, is the big point here. This should also be the point for you if this is something that you're working on. It's like, you know, is this a perfect authentic cadence, or is this a half cadence? Sticking to one and seeing that you can justify either or is important. But that's all that I really want to say about today's analysis. If you're interested in following me along on the journey to analyze all of Bach's chorale harmonizations, feel free to subscribe to the channel. You can hit the notification icon and like the video as well if you enjoyed the content, of course. Thank you so much for watching the video and supporting the channel by doing so. I look forward to tomorrow's analysis, and I hope you take care.